international science and technology policy. I'm so pleased we have David Albright with us today to talk about his brand new book on Taiwan's nuclear weapons program, its former nuclear weapons program. Before I introduce David, I just wanted to make a few announcements. This will be live streaming. It'll be up on YouTube. All of this is on the record. And so I would love it if you could put your phones to mute. Don't turn them off, because if you want to tweet, that would be terrific. But it's better not to have that interference with cell phones ringing. So I thank you for that. Taiwan's former nuclear weapons program is David's new book. This is just the latest in several of them, and he co-authored this with Andrea Stricker. David is the president of the Institute for Science and International Security. He's a physicist, and he, I don't know how best to describe you actually. This is kind of the thinking person's account of Taiwan's nuclear weapons program. Anytime I have a technical question, I tend to call you up. How do you calculate this or that? Anyway, David has testified often in front of Congress. He even did some inspections himself in Iraq way back when, in the first go-round, I think it was in the 1990s. And among his books include one on South Africa, revisiting South Africa's nuclear weapons program, and also Peddling Peril, how the secret nuclear arms trade arms America's enemies. And so David I'll give the microphone over to David. We're going to have a discussion a little bit after that as he tells you about his book, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. No, I'm happy to be here. I must confess, we like the production of things, not the dissemination of things. So I mean, it's wonderful that Sharon was willing to do this. We tend to fund these things up front, so we don't have to go out and sell the book. And in fact, it's available for free, and it's on various platforms. We're finding that these platforms like Amazon require a charge anymore. But if you want an Amazon or a Kindle-ready version, we can easily email it to you. And as I said, you can find it on our website. One of the principal sponsors of this was the Naval Postgraduate School, a program called PASS. I don't think I'll try to say what it is, but essentially it's grants from the Department, from DITRA, the Department of Defense, to look at issues that have impact on U.S. policy, and particularly looking forward to problems. And in our case, principal application is to countries like Iran and North Korea. So what does the Taiwan case tell us or teach us about those cases in the future? But the bottom line is that the book is available free, and we're more than happy to get a version you like free. Taiwan for us has been an issue since almost the founding of and I'll use ISIS, apologize for that, but I've had the name a long time. I may slip into use institute if I get nervous, but if I look in your eyes and there's a concern. But we were founded in about 1992, and it came up early in our history. It had been known that the program had been stopped dramatically by the United States government in 1988, but there was intense secrecy imposed on that. And we got involved through knowing people at the International Atomic Energy Agency. We've been involved in different parts of detection of that program. People here who've been involved in the effort, the one undertaken by the U.S. government. And it was we found it extremely difficult, and we created basically a watching program where whenever we had a chance, we would collect information on Taiwan. And a couple of years ago, the Taiwanese involved in the program wanted to talk. They were and they wanted to tell their stories. And then a person who was actually critical in this story, his Americanized name is Gary Chang. He was an agent of the CIA who was a senior nuclear official in the Taiwanese program in the from the 60s. He started up into becoming a very senior official in the 1980s. And so he was their mole within who could provide information about the program. And he decided to tell his story first in Chinese, and he published a memoir, which is largely not very technically rich by any means. But then we contacted him, and he agreed to allow us to interview him. And so we had this, in a sense, the Taiwanese side of the story opening up. And we weren't so much interested in the CIA angle, but he knew a tremendous amount about the nuclear weapons program. And so he could provide us a lot of detail, starting when he began in the 60s up till when he left in 1988. There are other Taiwanese, a general, who'd been chief of staff in the 1980s. It was really kind of the head of the, administrative head of the program, published his diary. And that provided information. And then Bill Burr, through his diligent efforts to declassify, was getting a steady stream of declassified State Department cables. And so we felt that the time had come where we could bring all this information together and produce a book, and we got the money essentially from the U.S. government to finish it. And I must say, that was probably only a small part of the total amount of money needed to research this program. It was definitely one of the hardest projects we've ever worked on. And I can talk more about why there was secrecy. But as far as I understand it, a lot of it, it's still viewed as secret by the U.S. government. And we don't feel we violated any rules, but certainly probably some of the things we learned from Dr. Chang and from Taiwanese sources probably are more than the CIA may want to declassify. Interestingly, Dr. Chang was under no restrictions on telling his story. They certainly weren't anxious for him to tell it, particularly early on when they actually feared there could be an assassination attempt against him. But he had no actual legal restrictions on him telling the story, and he would choose to keep certain things secret out of kind of deference to the CIA's, particularly sources and methods. But essentially, he was pretty open. Now, what did we find? One is, first is that it is a tremendous U.S. success story. The bureaucracy worked well. Some person, at least one, maybe more in here, were involved in the effort. It brought together U.S. intelligence with U.S. diplomacy, with Department of Defense, with the whole range. It was, at that time, ACTA existed. ACTA played a leading role. State Department, and so it was a tremendous effort that lasted well over a decade to try to rein in this program. And so one of our interests was, okay, if it was so successful, why did it work? And what they were really pioneering was the idea of denuclearization. And how do you define that? That was a big issue in the first round of confrontation with Taiwan in the 1970s, when parts of the program were uncovered. And how do you think about it? Getting rid of plutonium separation activities, trying to ban certain types of reactors, stopping enrichment. And then as the years went by, that effort and definition was expanded during this entire U.S. effort. To finally trying to make sure that if you had a nuclear institute, that it wouldn't have classified R&D in it. Or if you had a military institute, it wouldn't have any nuclear R&D. So, and they were able to impose that on Taiwan. I mean, it's a dream to do that in the case of Iran or North Korea, but again, it's part of this idea of developing what is denuclearization. Now, what did Taiwan accomplish? And this was for us a very big surprise. I mean, we'd studied the program for well over a decade and thought it was a relatively small effort. But in fact, by the 1980s, they wanted to have a program that in 3 to 6 months they could have a deliverable nuclear weapon. And they were instituting all the steps necessary to do that. And one of the things they were able to build on was that since the mid-60s, they've been working on the theory, simulation, and high explosive testing associated with a fission weapon. And so they had a tremendously sophisticated system to analyze and develop nuclear weapons. Short of a full-scale test, which they felt they could not do. The island was too small to support it. They had signed political deals not to do it in or over the ocean. And so their whole program was one of simulation theory backed up with extensive testing, high explosive testing. And we identified 2 sites, 2 high explosive sites, and we have satellite images in the book where some of that work was carried on. So with that background, they then had to worry about how do you get plutonium. And they had a research reactor they got from Canada that they felt they could use. The U.S. was pressing them hard to convert the reactor to a fuel type that would be hard to produce plutonium in. They were dragging their feet on that. They were dragging their feet on having spent fuel from the reactor shipped out of the country. And so they felt in the late 80s they had a reservoir of plutonium. And they also they'd been playing around with reprocessing. And we weren't fully satisfied with what we learned in about the 70s reprocessing. We did learn that the United States detected fission products, radioactive plume, 3 times in around 1976, 77, indicating that reprocessing of spent fuel had actually occurred. And they were never able to pinpoint where that occurred, and we weren't either. And unfortunately, Dr. Chang was not that senior at that time. He'd been studying, getting his PhD in the United States just prior to this episode, and so he could not provide any details. But it looked like in the 70s, Taiwan was able to basically lay down a basis to understand how to reprocess. And the way this works is if you can do it on a small scale, you can actually expand it to the level you would need for a nuclear weapons program. You're not going to build a Kojima French commercial reprocessing plant with that knowledge, but you can build a plant that can separate 10, 20 kilograms of plutonium from a research reactor, like the Taiwan, I'm wrong on my mind, hopefully a Taiwan research reactor. And in fact, that's what they started to do in the early to mid-80s, was build a reprocessing plant. Now, the U.S. was all over their main nuclear research site. The acronym is INER. And it's essentially incorporated in something called CIST, which is a military research and development site. They decided to move it off-site to what we call now Longtan. And we were able to identify the building, and we have satellite imagery of that building. And there, it was a facility that pretty extensive, bigger than I thought it would be. We were able to get some building schematics and understand the hot cell structure, which is thick concrete walls essentially, where you would be processing this highly radioactive spent fuel. And it was much more substantial than we would have thought, based on our initial understanding. And so what you had converging in the late 80s was a program that probably was going to be reaching a point of being able to build and deploy a nuclear weapon in 3 to 6 months. Now, where did the 3 to 6 months come from? General Howe, who was the chief of staff and military analysts, felt that they could only hold off a Chinese invasion for 3 to 6 months. And so they felt they had to get a nuclear weapon in that period of time. Again, it's crazy, from our point of view, a crazy idea. You can come up with all kinds of arguments why it was suicidal to do it, and why building the weapons would make it more dangerous for Taiwan, not less dangerous. But nonetheless, the military in Taiwan didn't believe that. And so they wanted this program carried out. And we think they would have succeeded if not for U.S. intervention. And we think Dr. Dr. Chang played a role. We think there were other spies in the program that we don't know about. Particularly in the 70s, we would get reports from people involved about information they would have received about what the Taiwanese were saying that could only come from well, maybe a communication intercept. Let me not deny that, but certainly information that must be coming from spies. But it wasn't a complete look. And one of the things the United States pushed for very heavily, and it certainly has relevance today, was essentially that the United States would have the ability to do anytime, anywhere inspections in Taiwan. And that was created in the 1970s, and it was a critical part of this, that they were asked to go. And of course, it's not, there's always delays, but essentially they had the right under an agreement, a bilateral agreement with Taiwan, to have that kind of access. And at the same time, Taiwanese are trying to hide things, not fully declaring things, and trying to thwart that, which would be one of the reasons they would go off-site to build a reprocessing plant. And we're not sure, what we learned was that the United States wasn't 100% certain this was a reprocessing plant. We had one person who went saying that it was really only when they got inside that they were certain that it was actually a reprocessing plant. So again, U.S. information was limited. And one of the lessons of this is that the IAEA inspections are really the most important, but they only have meaning if they are close to anywhere, anytime inspections, and they can get to military sites. This nuclear site really was a military site. And I mean, it was called the First Division of CIST when it was created. And they had to create kind of a phony civil cover for it. But it was only in 1988 when the United States really imposed a split that it truly became a civil nuclear incident. And so, but the IA needs those kinds of powers, and they can do, and I would argue they can do a much better job than the United States understanding nuclear weapons programs. One thing is all the states in the world that have interest in this, including the 5 nuclear weapon states, participate. They have other states with different technology skills, and they have the ability to really systematically assess these things, where I think the U.S. does a tremendous job. Sometimes what we saw in the Taiwan case is they really didn't follow up things. They had and it's understandable, it's a government. They need to find out something, they need to find a way to stop it, build in a way to prevent recurrence. They don't necessarily want to know everything there is to know about what Taiwan did on reprocessing. I mean, they would, for the IA, they would want to know the entire history, which is also one of the strengths of the IA, is that they build their entire inspection effort on knowing the history of the nuclear program. And this was one of the great lessons of the 1991 Iraq War, and then also the South African denuclearization, is that you can't, the IA, and a country who's looking at another program can't assess that program without knowing its history. It's just not possible. And when you do it that way, you have a high risk of failure. And that was the IA lesson in 1991 in the Iraqi case, and also in the South Africa case as it developed, and also in the North Korean case in 92 and 93, that they absolutely had to know the history. And they were the best ones to do it. Let me stop there. I could talk for a long time, but I think questions, and I don't know what you're interested in. I mean, you all may not be policy people and could care if there's a reprocessing plant, or not even fully know what it is. So I'm happy to turn it over to Sharon and let her direct it.
Thank you. We have a microphone there that you can line up and, introduce yourself, put your statement or question in the form of a question. But I have tons of questions for you, David, and a few things so I'll start as you folks are thinking about your own questions for David. For those who may not be so familiar, can you just take us back a little bit to, this Taiwan's program benefited from the Atoms for Peace program, right? It had a civilian sort of overlay. But what struck me in reading through the history was how tightly entwined the military was in this. And I think that today, for a country today that might embark on this, they might do a better job at creating a more plausible or credible civilian structure. So you make the point that INER, the facility, it was eventually kind of just surrounded. It's in this military complex, right? So it's kind of hard for them to say, oh yeah, sure, there's no military component to this. The people were all there was I guess you would call it today, a fusion or an integration of mostly military. Can you just talk about the beginning of that program and why,
Sure.
and what happened politically? Obviously, Taiwan lost its political status in, was it 71? And there were certain triggers along the way that pushed them towards more urgency.
Yeah, I think in tracing the history, I think the first interest, I think, was when Chiang Kai-shek was still president of China in 1945, 46, with the Manhattan Project. I mean, they're Chinese, in his government, witnessed, it's called Operation Crossroads. It started in 1946, it was a above-ground atmospheric weapons test. And in one of the biographies, they were collecting data against U.S. wishes. And then I think with the Atoms for Peace, they saw an opportunity that in the back of their minds, they were part of the P5. China sat on the Security, the Taiwanese China sat on the Security Council. And so I think they saw themselves as a big power. Certainly they were scared of China, PRC, invading, and worried that they would need this. Now, I think the U.S. made it clear from the beginning that they weren't going to welcome a nuclear weapons program, and so that drove them toward everything would be peaceful. But in the early days, I don't think they hit it that much. I'm not sure the U.S. really hit it that much. So, and they had a tremendous shortage of trained personnel. And the military jumped up and said, we're going to start training people, and would send off their officers to university to get training in nuclear, and with the expectation that they would then work at INER, essentially, by the time it was created in 68. And so from the very beginning, the military was heavily invested in creating the kind of intellectual infrastructure. And then funding. INER was under the Ministry of Defense's budgets. The CISC actually had controlled the budget for INER. So clearly it was very much military. Everybody who worked on this that we talked to was worried about that, and split to try to make it look civilian was largely cosmetic, and that was seen through. And so if someone's doing this again now, I would look to Iran as having a much more sophisticated system. And one of the, I don't know if you're familiar with these nuclear archives that Netanyahu talked about April 30th, but in it is an interesting set of documents. In a sense, when Iran is caught red-handed with a nuclear weapons program back in 2002, 2003, how do they make it look civilian? And so many of the documents are on how they transform what were military programs into civilian programs. And that effort continues to today, where you have people who were involved in the nuclear weapons effort working at civil institutes in Taiwan, and the IA doesn't really have any idea what they're up to. And so again, in that sense, Iran would be a good example of how do you more cleverly hide it. And they also took the enrichment program and the associated fuel cycle and moved it over to the Atomic Energy Organization, which they could then call civil and undersea programs. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, so one thing though, I think that the International Atomic Energy Agency learned over time, and mostly through the Iraq experience, was that you had to keep interviewing people. And you had to see what they were working on and who they were talking to. One of the anecdotes in your book struck me, this David Ho, who worked under Chang, was a postdoc researcher at UC Berkeley, using the Cray computer to check some of his calculations. That stuff is really hard to ferret out. In hindsight, we know about that because I guess he's, did you interview David?
He approached us, we did not work with him. He wrote a book. He actually asked me to co-author a book with him about 10 years ago, and it just came at the wrong time. And there's all kinds of splits. I mean, some in Taiwan would like to really do in Dr. Chang and discredit him as a traitor to Taiwan. I was never quite sure if Dr. Ho was one of those. And I think he evolved from the time when he initially contacted me. But his story was, he provided some interesting information about computer simulations and how they avoid U.S. export controls and get the information they need.
How did you, were you able to corroborate, or how did you work with Gary Chang, as you call him? You said he wrote something in Chinese.
Yeah.
Was that published in Taiwan? Or?
Yes, and so we translated a good part of the book before we engaged with him. And then we would talk to people here. It was hard for us to really reach senior Taiwanese officials that would have been sort of involved at that level, plus many have passed away. But what we would try to do was correlate it with the things like Bill Burr's classification efforts were achieving interviews with U.S. officials, IAEA officials, because they collected a tremendous amount of information on this program. And to their credit, they were pretty weak in the 70s and 80s, but they did some very important work in Taiwan in the mid-70s to uncover, early to mid-70s to uncover secret plutonium-related facilities that the U.S. I don't think knew about. And so it was, and we had access to that kind of.
So I have a few other questions. In your last chapter, you talk a little bit about some of the policy implications, or the implications for the non-proliferation regime. And one thing you mentioned was that just as the U.S., which had considerable leverage over Taiwan, worked to denuclearize Taiwan, so too should China do that for its neighbor, North Korea. Can you talk, so I think there's this, well, I don't disagree with you, but there's a lot more complexity there. There are a lot of nuances in terms of the kinds of influence that the U.S. had over Taiwan, which was really enormous, and yet it took us decades to really kind of root out that program. But there is, I think, a kind of a myth in Washington that, well, the Chinese have more leverage with the North Koreans. Let's, they should take care of this. What, can you just expound a little bit more on your recommendation there?
One of the things that impressed me and Andrea was how conscientious the U.S. was to keep Taiwan from getting nuclear weapons. They really felt that it would increase the chance of war, and certainly would add to instability that would spread throughout the entire region. And so they took this quite seriously. I think that the comment that it wrote about China was that China never took it seriously with North Korea. I mean, it is much more complicated. But a lot of that complication comes from never doing anything to block the North Korean nuclear program. If they had been moving early in the 80s, in the 90s, China could have done quite a bit more. Now it's much harder, but they still can do a lot. I mean, if they wanted to, and you see some of it in the implementation of the UN Security Council sanctions. They can block exports, they can look at what's in the goods or in the packages that are being sent across the border from China into North Korea, which they often never did. And so, but again, it just stood, I don't know, it kind of just jumped out at us that there was this asymmetry in the approaches, and yet we're both, I would call client states, but close allies that were in a weakened position, that were vulnerable to pressure. And I have another thing too, which in very much contrast to the South Africa case, Taiwan never solved its security problems. I mean, in South Africa, it was they solved their security problems, they moved to give up nuclear weapons. Here, Taiwan gave up its nuclear weapons program without solving its security problem. And U.S. obviously is the guarantor, but it is a case where it kind of stands in opposition to those cases that say the only way forward is to solve security problems first. It takes a lot of pressure, and the U.S. exerted pressure. I mean, in the 1988 timeframe, when they really wanted to get a separation between CIS and INTER, they had to impose it on CIS. INTER really worked for CIS, and so they basically told CIS, which is develops all kinds of advanced weapons, missiles, planes, all kinds of things. They basically said, you know, if you don't make these changes, all the imports from the United States that you need for these other weapon systems are suddenly going to be blocked or will slow down. You know, so it always, I think every step of the way in Taiwan, it took pressure. And the U.S. would have to make it a credible pressure before the Taiwanese would really get in. Otherwise, they would just keep pushing forward.
Which brings me.
Going around.
Yeah.
In some ways, you know, the U.S. would push and then they would find a way.
So where do you think that leaves us with Saudi Arabia?
Well, one of the interesting denuclearization steps they did here was to have a very strong statement in a bilateral agreement of no R&D on reprocessing or enrichment. And that agreement was secret until Bill's group was able to get it declassified in State Department cables. But it's actually quite a model where it's not a ban on a big reprocessing plant, or enrichment plant, it's a ban on developing it. And I think that's the model for Saudi Arabia and I would say South Korea. And so these are two allies where we have tremendous leverage. And I think it makes perfect sense that a lesson of Taiwan is that it makes sense to demand those conditions. Because these enrichment and reprocessing plants serve no economic function. I mean, Saudi Arabia will never produce enriched uranium domestically cheaper than what it could buy internationally. And it applies the same to Iran, North Korea, right to Taiwan. And so it makes no sense to support these things. And one of the, and I think and I would hope the Trump administration would move in this direction. I have no idea if it would. But I do know in the negotiations between the three European countries and the United States on what was called trying to fix the nuclear deal, Trump overrode the effort in the end. But one of the agreements was that if Iran increased its centrifuge program, whenever that would happen under the agreement, if it's 5 years, 6 years from now, it would be by definition a military program, because there was absolutely zero reason for them to increase their program for civil need. And the E3 in the United States agreed to that. I mean, it's gone now, and as the E3 tries to save the nuclear deal. But still, it gives you a flavor that and this can be traced all the way back to Taiwan, where these enrichment and reprocessing plants in regions of tension, on balance, are nothing but trouble. Trying to stop.
But the US Taiwan, the restriction on reprocessing and enrichment, how recent is that? Is that just in the latest agreement?
No, it was
Or that
1977.
1977. I'd like to just talk a little bit about these nuclear cooperation agreements, because
And this was not in,
this was a secret part
this was
of
a
the
secret
agreement.
bilateral
Right.
agreement that covered more than that.
Right.
And,
So you talk in the book about, we know a certain amount, but there's still a lot of secrecy. And what was happening at the same time in the 70s was Congress rewrote or amended the Atomic Energy Act with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978. And one of the small requirements in that act was that all of our nuclear cooperation agreements would have to be rewritten to include these new 9 non-proliferation requirements. And I won't go into those, but there were only 2 that were not rewritten.
really, Taiwan has said.
Taiwan and South Korea. And the reason, my speculation is, the reason they weren't rewritten, and they were relatively recent, right? Because Taiwan's was done in 72, I want to say, and I think South Korea's was 74. The reason why is because they both had military programs, and the NNPA required a non-proliferation assessment, and that would have, even a classified one, would have exposed some of what was happening.
And we didn't, some of this is beyond what we could really look at, but it was really clear that the U.S. administration was very worried about those laws. And that was one of the reasons they were so strict. But they couldn't stop these enrichment programs. I mean, they weren't sure about the reprocessing. But they knew they were enrichment programs that they would stop them because they would catch them. And they caught them on laser enrichment twice, and they caught them on chemical enrichment in the early 1980s. And they, I don't think they could ever be sure they would fully stop. So I think the laws were very threatening. And that was one of the reasons we decided there was so much secrecy was applied to this case, was the concern about congressional reactions. There were others too, but that was.
Yeah. So just before we're going to turn to audience questions, but a coda on this nuclear cooperation agreement, the Taiwan agreement, the renewed agreement, is the very first to just be very boldly, in no expiration date. So Taiwan has now said it will not do enrichment or reprocessing on its soil. Fantastic thing. The agreement has no expiration, and so Congress will never get an opportunity, the kinds of things that the U.S. is engaged in.
Well,
So-
and one thing I can add, in the 80s, after this happened, in the early 90s when the additional protocol, in fact, it was really the post-Iraq inspection reforms. Taiwan was one of the first to volunteer to intrusive IAEA inspections, and the IAEA jumped on it. I think by 94, 95, they visited the reprocessing plant, the high explosive sites. There was some residual laser enrichment capabilities that they were interested in. And then when the additional protocol came into force, Taiwan was one of the first, and the IAEA took advantage of it and conducted quite a remarkable set of inspections and efforts to kind of ensure that Taiwan didn't try to resurrect its program, because we also found, and I think it was in the media, that their kind of interest in nuclear weapons would kind of erupt at different times in the 90s and early 2000s. And the IAEA, and again, it was very secret. I mean, it's the amount of secrecy that surrounds this whole thing is remarkable. And Congress was one fear. China's another one. What China may do. Obviously, the Taiwanese were really unhappy about this. They felt you could see it in the General Howe's diary, that this was national humiliation they were being subjected to. And the U.S. decided that if you're going to do that, then maybe secrecy is the best way to do it.
Well, the one quote, and I'll leave it at this, that I love in this book is Howe's diary. He says, "What do the Americans want? Do we really have to kill these scientists
Oh, that's right.
to get like what is going to satisfy the Americans. So, so we have a question here.
Yeah, do I need to
Do
go
you
to the
want-
microphone?
It's better for
Yeah.
our listeners and watchers online.
Thank you, Edward F. Hoover Institution. How much did mainland China know about what was going on in Taiwan? I would have thought that they would have excellent sources and that they would have been highly alarmed about all this for several reasons.
We were less successful in really finding a Chinese source that would help us. I mean, we relied, and this goes back a while, on James Lilly, who had been in China, worked with the Chinese on intelligence cooperation, he was involved in Taiwan, as, I think he was station chief. And so what we learned was they exchanged information. But the US really had been the ones successful penetrating the nuclear program. That the Chinese certainly had penetrated the political apparatus and other parts, but had not gotten too deep into the nuclear. And I think from my own view, this is just an assessment, I think the Chinese came to rely on the United States to deal with this problem, and were, in that sense, somewhat relaxed. And so long as the US was working effectively, it was okay. But again, I didn't talk to any Chinese who could tell me authoritatively how they do this.
Yeah.
Edward Levine, Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. If, and there is a challenge in trying to get the Chinese to exert the kind of pressure on North Korea that we did over the years on Taiwan. Perhaps one reason is that North Korea has been more determined to avoid that kind of pressure. But you see now and then some hints that the North Koreans would like the United States as a counterweight to China. I wonder if there is any potential for a two-nation guarantee with strings to make sure that the nuclear program is decommissioned and destroyed.
Yeah, no, I think that would have to be the solution. I think it's going to require both. Providing guarantees. I mean, the North Koreans are tough. I mean, I've been in meetings with North Koreans, Kim Dae-Hwan, dinner, where, I don't know if you know Madam Che, she's a very senior official now. Her view, this goes back a while, this is probably 2007. I mean, her view was, well, can't North Korea be like Israel in North Asia? So clearly just trying to play us against China. So I mean, I think this will work, but we're going to have to be very careful not to get played, and the Chinese will have to be very careful not to get played by the North Koreans. But I think to me, that's the only way it's going to work. And I wish China had done more. I mean, I think, obviously, I think they could have, and I know back in the early 2000s, they, at the request of the United States, clamped down on exports to North Korea. There had been I don't know, I can't remember all the details, a case of tributyl-phosphate used in wood processing had gone from India to North Korea, or had there been an attempt, and U.S. had gone to China, and China was in a cooperative mood, and it really clamped down on the border to where North Korea protested vehemently that their imports were being interfered with. But China stuck with it. But in the way the six-party talk was structured, was that once negotiations started, the sanctions, whatever they were, came off, and China just stopped controlling the border. So I think that's, one wish they hadn't stopped, because it could have certainly interfered in North Korea's ability to outfit its nuclear program.
Other questions?
Milton Honig from the International Center for Terrorism Studies, going back to 1974. Now, how did what the Indians were doing with the same research reactor, find heavy water from the United States, et cetera, et cetera? What did the U.S. learn from what went on with the 1974 test in Iran that is applied directly to the situation in India, or applied directly to the situation in Taiwan?
I think it's a big impact. I mean, the mantra we heard was, we've got to make sure Taiwan is not another India. So I think it was a wake-up call. And I think in the declassified State Department cables, you can see that the U.S. effort became more serious. There had been in the early 70s, some officials had been pretty tolerant of Taiwan's actions to get reprocessing or move ahead. Because I mean, clearly, the U.S. intelligence was picking up signs that Taiwan was working on developing the nuclear weapon itself. And but I think that test was a true wake-up call that more had to be done.
One of the,
Oh, I just want to follow up. Did we, I can't remember, did we actually give Taiwan heavy water
Yes.
for that? We did.
No, it's U.S.
It was a
heavy water.
CANDU reactor, but.
But it's U.S. heavy water.
I
And
quote
when
David
did-
in
when
his
did we-
1998 article, so he says in that article that the U.S. gave
Yeah.
Taiwan.
But what was the date for that?
Oh,
Because I mean, that
early
was,
70s.
so was before India actually tested.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we had been giving heavy water.
No, the reactor, you know,
Yeah.
it was, like Milt said, it's the exact copy of the uranium reactor. A little change, but it's essentially a heavy water, natural uranium fuel, and ideal to make high quality plutonium. And you know, in one of the, we tried to tell the story, I mean, the Taiwanese, given that they had to do things covertly, were quite ingenious in trying to work out ways to defeat the safeguard system. And to, you know, one of the challenges they had was, you know, they had this long fuel rods, and there's cameras, and how do you get it out of the spent fuel pond if you want to reprocess it? And one of the, took a couple years for the U.S. and the IA to figure this out, but what the Taiwanese did is develop what's called a segmented fuel rod. Because normally you have a long metal rod with uranium fuel, in this case metal fuel throughout the thing. They developed a fuel rod where it would be, let's say, 10 centimeters of uranium, then you'd have an aluminum spacer, another 10 centimeters of uranium, and just work your way up. And IA safeguards at that point in time just looked, is this rod irradiated or not? It didn't look at its structure. And so the Taiwanese would be able to radiate that in the reactor to make plutonium, move it into the spent fuel pond, and then they could cut it at the spacers and get it down into short rods that they could then kind of sneak out of the spent fuel pond. And there was, the U.S. and the IA discovered this, but particularly the U.S. discovered it in about 76 or 7. But it shows just how Taiwan thought about, you know, how to solve this, in a sense, the safeguard problem, and how to make sure they could be able to reprocess this irradiated fuel.
One other question. I believe I recall in your article in the 1998, you mentioned, I believe, Dr. Wu, yes?
Yes.
The article begins with him, and so the article is essentially dedicated to him as a person who very early opposed the weapons program.
Yeah, the first manifestation of it,
What's up with him?
post,
Is he-
post-Chinese test, yeah, he's in the book. We have more from him in the book. Yeah, he passed away, so we weren't able to go back to him, but the program really got rolling after the 1964 Chinese test, as you know, and so and the Taiwanese reaction is, why don't we go out and buy a heavy water reactor, a reprocessing plant, and a heavy water production plant, and just buy it. And it's gonna cost about $120 million. At that point in time, they had almost nobody in Taiwan that could run those facilities. But they found countries willing to sell them these things, and the U.S. was trying to block it. Germany, for example, was willing to play ball. Siemens in particular. And so Dr. Wu was asked by Chiang Kai-shek to review this plan. And he had just been appointed, in a sense, the science advisor to the president. And he reviewed it and said it's crazy. I mean, it's huge, at that time, a huge expense for Taiwan. They didn't have that much hard currency. And they didn't have the personnel to do it. And so he was able to argue successfully to drop it. Where he failed, and in 1998, when we talked to him, he told us this, that he wasn't successful in stopping kind of what it would be a natural reaction to that. It's, okay, we don't have enough people, okay, let's start training even more. We can't buy these big facilities, well, maybe we should start thinking of indigenous development of smaller ones. So he was disappointed that his work didn't stop the nuclear weapons program, because he had also argued quite convincingly why nuclear weapons were not in Taiwan's national security interests. But he didn't convince the president or his son of that.
Hi, Jonathan Parker, I'm an intern with the U.S. Department of State. So you mentioned earlier, I think you said in the late 70s that Taiwan and the United States had entered into a secretive bilateral agreement outside, separate from the 123 agreement, that included a political commitment on Taiwan's part to end all research and development on enrichment and reprocessing. And then I think, if I heard right, you alluded to maybe that being a similar avenue that could be pursued with Saudi Arabia. And my question would be, what is the difference between that kind of political commitment and what the administration has called the gold standard that they say that they're intent on pursuing with Saudi Arabia, and any 123 agreement where it's just an outright prohibition on enrichment and reprocessing?
Yeah, it would be an alternative. I mean, the 123 agreement would be the best place to put it. And then it would be more legally binding. I mean, this bilateral agreement between Taiwan and the United States has its limitations. And also, in the 80s, when General Howe looked at it, his two issues were, how do I get out of it, and how do I reinterpret it? So that he felt he could work on nuclear weapons, but be abiding by that agreement. So instead of reprocessing, they weren't actually planning to reprocess spent fuel. They were only going to make medical isotopes. And one can argue, how effective that is, but in their mind, it was the way for them to justify building a reprocessing plant. And so the 123 agreement is a sounder way to do it.
And then I have a separate, unrelated question. So I was just wondering if you could speak to maybe the way in which Taiwan's weapons program affected the politics of Southeast Asia as a whole. Maybe if there was anything public, or even with the relationship with China, if China had any kind of public response to this.
Most of this is happening in secret. So there was a real effort to keep this from being a point of discussion. I think in one cable, the United States wrote, this is later, in the 80s, they wrote a whole series of reasons why a Taiwanese nuclear weapons program is a bad idea. And one of which was that if Taiwan was seen as having that kind of capability, which would involve, let's say, even the reprocessing plant, that it would create tremendous stress with its neighbors who are parties to the non-proliferation treaty. So they just went through a list from the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, and it would create quite a bit of stress and insecurity about what was going on.
Other questions? Do you have any last thoughts you want to share with us? Oh, I do have a on your,
Yeah, I
gathering
think-
your thoughts. You and your organization have become, I guess, we're among the first really to use satellite imagery, publicly available satellite imagery. In the course of looking at Taiwan's program and in researching this book, how much was it more important to talk to people versus looking at that imagery? Or maybe it was tough to get old imagery going back.
Well, I didn't, in the book, you can see the images of the reprocessing plant. The Taiwanese designed that so it wouldn't have any signatures of the reprocessing plant from overhead imagery. They were very cognizant of what the US could do. And so we relied on human sources. And we wanted documents. So for example, on the reprocessing plant, we needed a map where the processing plant is marked on that map before we would then buy an image to then look at it. So I mean, in this kind of program, a lot of effort is made to hide things. And even in the high explosive facilities, the way they hide it is it conducts conventional military high explosive. So it was only because we knew from Dr. Chang and others that these kind of nuclear weapons related experiments happened at those sites that we knew that this had another purpose. But if you looked at it in overhead, you would see a conventional military high explosive test site. Or, we're two involved in this. And we had plenty of other uses. So I would say that in general, these kind of programs are, because they're so hidden and it's really not just civil. You hide the nuclear in civil, and they spend an inordinate amount of time coming up with civil justifications. And you hide it in military, non-nuclear military work. And between those two, if you don't have an inside source, it's almost impossible to penetrate. We had one person who was deeply involved in this who quoted in the book where, you would be pushing on the Taiwan nuclear officials, and they would say it's all civil, it's civil. He would start to doubt his sanity after a while because the defense was so robust and so thought through, and that if he didn't have this other information from the U.S. intelligence, he wasn't sure that they could prevail in that kind of interaction. And even when the U.S. went to this reprocessing plant after Chang has been exfiltrated, so he's gone. They're confronting the Taiwanese. The senior Taiwan official is vehemently denying it's a reprocessing plant. It's to do, the technical version is that it's to separate Moly-99 from medical isotopes. And you can take that from the radium targets. And one of the U.S. people finally turns to him and says, "Stop lying." And he still wouldn't change his story. And actually filed a diplomatic protest against this guy. When the IA went back in, but when they went to the reprocessing plant, they were just flat out told it was for reprocessing. And they were given the straight story. I mean, this happens in programs in around 94, 95, the Taiwanese government was very open about the nuclear weapons program with the inspectors. I would be surprised if they would be open today, but in that period of time, they were, and just admitted that this was to separate plutonium from nuclear.
Do you think the Taiwanese were so savvy about, well, for lack of a better term, their deception, so savvy about hiding things because they were close allies with the U.S.? I mean, they were technically sophisticated.
Well,
I mean, if they had access to if the U.S. were sharing, for example, satellite imagery with them on other things, they'd be able to tell how good some of our imagery was, right?
Yeah, but they had a fundamental problem, and this is also one of the weaknesses of their, in a sense, of nuclear strategy. They make a decision, we've got to build a bomb in 3 to 6 months and have it deliverable, which was going to be an attack aircraft. the United States had blocked the ballistic missile program earlier. So but they had developed an indigenous attack aircraft that they designed a warhead to fit under. But they knew that if China learned they were building a bomb, if they triggered this decision and went to build it, China would attack them as soon as they found out. So they had to have immense secrecy, first of all, to keep China from knowing, and then second, to keep the United States from knowing. So I think they really worked on this, and that speaks to why people like Dr. Chang were so important, because they were high-level officials in the program who could tell the U.S. what was really going on, and it was critical. And even another thing I was kind of amazed by is all countries like this have to wrestle with miniaturization of the warhead. It's just they start early on it, and they have to, because their delivery systems, the ballistic missiles they can build, the attack aircraft, just cannot. They don't have a bomber like we had to drop a bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
So for non-technical experts, miniaturization does not mean the size of your cell phone. It just means getting it below what, like 500 kilograms or
half a meter, but in
Yeah.
Taiwan's case, it turned out that they thought about it as a missile, and the warhead, the reentry vehicle wasn't that wide, but even for an attack aircraft, they were going to put it underneath, and they had to reduce it down to about a half a meter. And the way they were going to do it was, one of the ways.
Diameter is about this.
Yeah, and so one of the things they did, in fact, was, you normally think of, nuclear weapon as, should have to have a picture. I mean, this would be kind of this is a schematic, this is from this nuclear archives in Iran that Israel sees. I mean, this is kind of a standard picture of a crude schematic. It's unclassified. It's a levitated core design. This one has weapon-grade uranium.
That one of Netanyahu's slide?
Yeah, and or provided to the media. I can't remember which one, but I think he showed this. But the idea, this is an empty gap, and it's a little bit, if you pound a nail in a piece of wood, there's two ways to do it. You take the hammer, put it on the nail, and push, or you lift the hammer and strike the nail. This is the lab design. And it's a fairly straightforward step for proliferant states to take. Iran does it. This is an Iranian design. So but what they did in Taiwan is they made this oval shaped. That's how, because they didn't really care about the length if it's under a plane, but they care a lot about its diameter. So the idea was just make it oval shaped. And that was the design they were working on at the end of the program and trying to finish the miniaturization. And it was all done through computer simulation by '84, so they'd gotten a supercomputer. They had gotten access to U.S. computers, and the way they worked it was well, the background is if you do reactor safety and you worry about a nuclear accident, you have a very large amount of fissioning going on in a reactor accident. That's only one step removed from a nuclear weapon. And so if you can get the codes, the most advanced codes on reactor safety, particularly excursions of a reactor, that can help you in designing a nuclear weapon. You have to modify them, of course. Export controls kept Taiwan from getting those codes. And so they were developing codes on their own, and they wanted to know how well they would work. So they would take their nuclear weapons codes and then answer questions related to civil or to reactor accidents. They would come up with an answer. That answer then would be fed into the U.S., access to the U.S. codes running a similar problem, and they would see do they agree. And if they didn't, they'd go back to the nuclear weapons code and modify it, and then recalculate, and then feed it back into the U.S. code to see if it would agree better. And that's what Ho was doing in California. And we identified one or two of the professors that were helping him. We decided not to contact them. I think they're both alive. Dr. Ho had called him Dr. C. From that, we were able to figure out who they were. But you had a very clever way around our export controls. But you have the US government to protect you.
I'm Pierce Gordon, currently an advisor to the Holy See Mission in New York for disarmament issues. Looking ahead, you mentioned that you didn't think Taiwan would be as open now as they might have been back in the, late 80s or so?
90s, mid-90s.
Mid-90s. What's the prospect that Taiwan could move to an energy economy that didn't need uranium at all, i.e. no reactors for power purposes, whatever they would do still with research reactors, if they in effect went beyond the gold standard and just said, okay, we're not gonna use nuclear energy for electricity at all, and just go to a completely renewable energy base.
I think I'm a little out of touch. I mean, they passed, there was decisions made to get rid of nuclear power. And again, in this work that we were looking at, I mean, you're trying to get rid of the nuclear weapons program, enrichment and processing, and you're encouraging them to build nuclear power reactors. And one can argue, maybe that's not the best approach, but it's a way to split the community to, say, nuclear energy. We do it in Iran. I mean, no one's objecting to the Bushehr reactor, as far as I know. I'm not sure. But traditionally, the Bushehr reactor is tolerated in Iran, and if it wants to build more nuclear power plants, it's all okay. So the same strategy was done in Taiwan. The Taiwanese people, because again, and I've been very loose. I mean, in the book, we're very careful. Chinese in Taiwan is different than the native Taiwanese. And when China came, or when Chiang Kai-shek came, he brought 2 million people, and it took over an island that had 4 million people living on it, and was incredibly repressive and brutal. And so it took a long time for democracy to come. Probably it was the first free election in the late 90s, I think. It was for the president at least. And so, but I think when the democracy came, I think the majority came out and said we want to get rid of nuclear power. But easier said than done. I think I've lost touch. At one point, 45% of the electricity was for nuclear. This goes back a couple of decades. I don't know what it is now. So trying to phase out the plants is very complicated, and it swings back and forth. But I think, I don't know, maybe someone in the room, maybe you shake your head. Maybe you could say something that you seem to know, because I think there was an effort recently to undo some of the anti-nuclear actions that had been
The opposition party right now, their agenda is to oppose the ruling party's policy on abandoning all the nuclear. Because the ruling party, the Democratic and Progressive Party, they shut down all the nuclear power plants. They also want to dismantle the new one, not commissioned yet. But the opposition party, the Kuomintang, right now they are saying that there's no way if you do that. They want to revive the nuclear reactors. It's a hot topic.
Yeah, no, and it is. I mean, Germany's doing it, but it's a struggle. I mean, and Germany's being forced to increase coal use because of this. I mean, these are base load electricity generators, and it's. But I think the majority was clear. I mean, and I'm sure it would happen again. That it would probably they want to get rid of all nuclear power.
Solutions, renewable plus storage.
Sure. But it's hard. I agree with you, but it's hard. It's just hard to do.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Yeah, I think
Oh,
we have
another one?
one last thing I'm gonna say.
My microphone is dead. Yes, any policy?
Oh, policy. Oh, okay, yeah. One thing I did want to say, I think one of the things we learned in this, because was involving Dr. Chang. I mean, when we did a study back in the 90s, we published it in 1998, I think Milton referred to it. We stayed away from the whole 1988 episode. And we were told by U.S. officials, you get people killed. If you delve into that, I think probably that was an exaggeration, but we stayed away. And but this time we really did fully immerse ourselves in what happened. And I think Dr. Chang is a hero. but he was vilified in Taiwan. He was indictment was issued for years. If he traveled, he could have been picked up by Interpol and extradited to Taiwan. And I think there's a need for Taiwan to recognize that he is a hero. When he published his book, he was pretty severely attacked. So some of these forces that he's a traitor are still there, but he did this as a patriot. That he is a native-born Taiwanese, and he loves his country, and he felt that the country was embarked on a path that could very likely destroy the country. And so this was a patriotic act, not an act of treason.
Edward Levine again. What does the history of the Taiwan program tell us about the usefulness or limitations of computer simulations? And what are its implications for stockpile stewardship here in the United States?
Yeah, I think for crude, crude by U.S. standards fission weapons, it's very troubling what computers can do. But again, it's not the computer itself. It's mating it with a high explosive testing program. I mean, you really, one by itself isn't going to get you very far. But if you put the two together, it's an extremely powerful way to understand these cruder fission weapons. I don't know how well it will work in the U.S., but I would imagine it will work pretty well if they can do the necessary experimentation for the codes. But again, I don't know. I'm sure we've had this debate. I mean, I'm a little bit out of touch. I mean, the U.S. builds these weapons that are on the edge of knowledge, and it always anticipated they would be able to build new ones, continue testing, and so then if you then say, well, can we maintain those for the ages? I'm sure that it's a pretty intensive debate.
All right, well, thanks to all of you for joining us today, but also let's thank David. So the book will be on, this session will be on YouTube, and your book is available
Yeah, on our website,
on the website, which is
Amazon
isis-online.org.
And if you do, and as I said earlier, if you want a Kindle version, we can just give us your email, we can send you the file, it'll load automatically on a Kindle.